Hook. The letter was already waiting when she stepped off the train. A station boy pressed it into her hand without a word, like he'd been told not to look her in the eye. Amelia's fingers were shaking, from the cold, from the miles, from 6 months of holding everything together with nothing but grit and stubbornness. And she had to shift Ethan to her other hip just to break the envelope's seal. The baby grabbed at the paper. She pulled it back. She read it once. Then she read it again, because the first time she told herself she must have misunderstood. I cannot accept a woman with another man's child. Do not come to my ranch. Do not seek me out in town. I wish you no harm, but I cannot help you. R. Calloway. That was it. 11 words of rejection after 4 months of letters. After she had sold everything. After she had buried her husband and packed a single trunk and stepped onto a westbound train with $6, a 6-month-old boy. And the desperate belief that a man in Arizona had meant what he wrote. The platform buzzed with people brushing past her. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked. The train behind her heaved and groaned and then, slowly, pulled away. Amelia stood there in the January wind, holding her baby and the letter, and the entire town of Red Hollow watched her the way people watch a barn fire, with interest, but no intention of helping. If this story moves you, if you've ever been left standing somewhere with nothing but your own 2 feet and a reason to keep going, please subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Part 1. The first thing Amelia noticed about Red Hollow was that it smelled like horse and iron, and something else she couldn't name, something sharp and mineral that rose off the desert floor and settled in the back of her throat. She'd expected it to feel like the frontier stories she'd read in Philadelphia parlors, the ones with words like wide and vast and boundless. Instead, it felt closed, tight, like a fist. She tucked the letter into her coat pocket and looked down at Ethan. He was watching her face the way babies do when they suspect the world is not right, but don't yet have the language to say so. He hadn't cried. He'd been unnaturally quiet since Kansas, as if he understood, in whatever wordless way infants understand things, that his mother didn't have room right now for consoling him. "We're all right," she told him, which was almost certainly not true. She picked up her trunk, or she tried to. It was too heavy to manage with one arm, and Ethan wasn't old enough to be set down on a train platform in January, so she stood there for a moment just holding both of them, the baby and the bag, suspended between what she'd hoped this place would be and what it actually was. A man nearby watched her struggle and turned away. That told her most of what she needed to know about Red Hollow. She made it as far as the bench outside the station master's window before her legs gave out on her. Not from weakness, exactly. More from a kind of sudden reckoning. She sat down hard on the wooden slats, Ethan pressed to her chest, and she looked at the street in front of her. Horses, a few wagons, a dry goods store, a saloon already lit at 3 in the afternoon. Women in dark wool coats moving with the purposeful speed of people who have someplace warm to be. Not one of them looked at her. Inside the station, through the dirty glass, she could see the station master watching her. He was a round man in a brown vest with a mustache that seemed to occupy more of his face than it should have. He wasn't hostile exactly. He had the look of a man who had seen too many women arrive in this condition, hopeful, then stranded, and had decided some time ago that it wasn't his problem to solve. Amelia squared her shoulders and went inside. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm looking for the Calloway Ranch." The station master looked at her over his mustache. "You the woman he was expecting?" "I was. He's changed his mind." "Ah." He said it the way people say "ah" when they already knew and were just waiting for you to catch up. "Well, stage back east goes Thursday, if you've got fare." "Thursday is 4 days away." "It is." "Is there a boarding house? A hotel?" "There's the Miners' Rest on Sutter Street. Mrs. Daly runs it. She's particular about who she takes in." He looked at Ethan, who chose that moment to make a small, unhappy sound and press his face into Amelia's neck. The station master's mustache shifted. "She don't take in children under 2. Amelia held very still. "Is there anywhere else?" "Not that's respectable." She wanted to say something sharp to that, She wanted to point out that respectability was a word men invented to keep women manageable, and that she had not crossed 1,700 miles of American geography to be lectured on it by a man with a mustache. But she had $6 and a baby and 4 days until the next stage east, so instead she said, "Thank you," and went back outside. The cold hit her again. Harder this time. She sat back down on the bench and thought about her options with the particular clarity that comes when there are very few of them. She could try Mrs. Daly anyway and see what happened. She could sleep in the station if she could negotiate it. She could, and this one she let herself sit with for only a moment, she could walk to the Calloway Ranch and make him look her in the face when he said no. She rejected that last one not because she was afraid of the confrontation, but because she didn't know how far the ranch was, and it was getting dark. And she had a baby. Ethan was starting to fuss properly now, a wet, hungry sound that she recognized as the kind that wouldn't stop without feeding and changing. She dug through the bag at her feet for the small covered jar she'd filled on the train, thinking about logistics instead of feelings because feelings were not useful right now, and logistics were. That was when she heard the boots. Not heavy exactly, more deliberate, the kind of walk that doesn't hurry and doesn't apologize for it. She looked up. The man was tall in the angular, undecorated way of men who spend most of their time outdoors and none of it thinking about how they look. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that wasn't quite handsome but was specific, which was better. He was looking at her with the careful, measuring expression of a man who has learned to assess a situation before he opens his mouth. He stopped a few feet away, not close enough to crowd her. He looked at Ethan, then back at her, then at the trunk on the ground. "You're the Calloway bride," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was," she said. "I appear to have been demoted." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. "I'm Cole Walker. I run the Walker Ranch 7 miles south. I have a housekeeper and 2 ranch hands and more space than I need." He paused. "You can stay until you figure out what comes next. No strings attached." She stared at him. "You don't know me." "No. I have a baby." "I noticed. Why would you—" "And because it's cold," he said, "and you've got nowhere to go, and because Calloway's a coward who didn't have the spine to come say that to your face." He bent and picked up her trunk before she could argue. "You don't have to come, but the offer's real." Amelia looked at him. She looked at the station behind her and the street ahead of her and the sky going orange-gray at the edges. She thought about Thursday and the stage east and what Philadelphia would look like when she came back empty-handed. She thought about Ethan, who had stopped fussing and was now watching Cole Walker with the frank, evaluating stare that babies turn on strangers. "All right," she said. Cole Walker nodded and started walking toward the hitching post where a wagon sat waiting. It was not the arrival she had planned. It was not the beginning she had imagined when she'd written that first letter to a man she'd never met, or the second, or the fifth, full of careful optimism and deliberate honesty. She had told Robert Calloway everything. About Thomas, who had died of fever the previous spring. About Ethan, who was Thomas's son and the best thing that had ever happened to her. About herself, what she was good at and what she wasn't, and what she hoped for. She had, in other words, given him the truth. And he had taken 4 months to decide the truth was unacceptable. She followed Cole Walker to the wagon with her jaw set and her back straight, because she was not going to give Red Hollow the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. The wagon seat was hard and cold, and Cole Walker was not a man who filled silence with talk, which suited Amelia well enough. She sat with Ethan in her lap and watched the town give way to open land, and she let herself feel, just briefly, the weight of what had happened. She had loved Thomas, not in the storybook way. They'd been young and practical and broke, and love had looked like working side by side and arguing about money and sitting next to each other in the evening because that was where they both happened to be. He'd died in April of a fever that took him in 5 days, and she'd been 6 months pregnant, and then her brother-in-law had politely but firmly made it clear that she and the baby were not a permanent arrangement he'd planned for. So she'd answered an advertisement. She'd done what hundreds of women before her had done. Taken the gamble, trusted the words on the page, and hoped that the man behind them was decent enough to mean what he wrote. Robert Calloway had not been decent enough. "Can I ask you something?" she said, about 3 miles out of town. Cole glanced at her. "You can ask." "Why did you really do it? Coming to the station, offering. There must have been easier things to do with your afternoon." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought maybe he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I was there when Calloway got the last letter you sent him, the one with Ethan's photograph. He showed it to half the men at the feed store, laughing, saying he wasn't about to take on some dead man's problem." He kept his eyes on the road. "I don't know you, but I know what it looks like when a man thinks he's better than a situation he helped create." Amelia was quiet for a long time after that. When they arrived at the Walker Ranch, the housekeeper was already on the porch. Margaret Hale was a woman somewhere north of 50 who wore her gray hair pinned back with ruthless efficiency and had the watchful face of someone who had survived enough to stop being surprised by much. She looked at Amelia, looked at Ethan, and looked at Cole with the particular expression of a woman who has strong opinions she is, for the moment, keeping to herself. "Mrs. Whitaker," Cole said. "Margaret Hale. She keeps this place from falling into the ground." "I keep this place from falling into the ground," Margaret said, mostly to herself. Then to Amelia, "Come inside, you look half frozen. Is the baby hungry?" "He's always hungry," Amelia said. Something softened marginally in Margaret's face. "Come in, then." The house was not elegant. It was the kind of house built entirely for function, the kind built with the understanding that the frontier didn't reward ornamentation. But it was warm, and that was the thing Amelia felt most immediately: warmth and the smell of something cooking, and the small, almost painful relief of being inside a place that wasn't trying to push her out. She sat at the kitchen table and fed Ethan while Margaret moved around her with the brisk efficiency of a woman on a schedule. Cole had disappeared. She heard him outside talking to one of the ranch hands. "I'll stay just long enough to figure out my next step," Amelia said. "I don't want to impose." Margaret set a plate of bread and cold beef on the table beside her. "Eat first, impose later." Amelia almost laughed. It surprised her, that reflex. The way the body remembered what laughter felt like, even when you'd had no recent cause for it. "He said no strings attached." "Cole means what he says," Margaret told her. "That's one of about 3 reliable things about him. Now eat." The first week was strange. Not bad, exactly. Strange in the way that any abrupt transplantation is strange, when you're still trying to locate your own bearings. Amelia slept in a small room off the kitchen that was clean and too cold at night and smelled of cedar. Ethan slept in a wooden crate lined with quilts that Margaret had produced from somewhere without comment. Amelia got up twice in the night to feed him and sat in the kitchen darkness those nights listening to the desert sounds, which were not the Philadelphia sounds she knew. No carriages, no neighbors, no sounds of human proximity, just wind and occasional coyotes and the particular silence that belongs to large, empty land. She had expected to feel displaced. She did feel displaced, but underneath the displacement was something she hadn't expected: quiet. Not peace. She wasn't foolish enough to mistake the absence of immediate crisis for peace, but a kind of stillness that she hadn't had in months, maybe a year. Since before Thomas got sick. Since before everything started collapsing. She was careful not to be in Cole's way. She kept herself useful, washing dishes, helping Margaret in the kitchen, handling Ethan's needs without asking for help unless she absolutely needed it. She was not sure if this was dignity or stubbornness. Probably both. They often looked the same from the outside. On the 4th morning, she came outside to find Cole at the corral fence, watching one of his hands work a young horse. She stood back so as not to disturb him, but he heard her and turned. "How's the baby sleeping?" he asked. "Better." Margaret made him a warmer cover. He nodded. They stood there for a moment watching the horse move in circles. "I went to see about the stage on Thursday," she said. "It's full. Next available is 3 weeks out." He looked at her. "Is that a problem?" "For you, maybe. I've already imposed more than I intended." "You haven't imposed at all." He turned back to the horse. "There's work here that needs doing if you want it. Nothing glamorous, cooking, washing, helping Margaret with the accounts. It would earn your room and board while you wait. If you want it.
no obligation. She studied the side of his face. He had a way of offering things that didn't feel like charity, that felt instead like a straightforward transaction, one adult to another, take it or leave it. She hadn't met many people who could do that. "I'll take it," she said. He nodded once. Good. That apparently was that. The work was harder than she'd expected, which she hadn't expected, which told her something unflattering about her own assumptions. She could cook, that she was good at, but the kind of cooking required for a working ranch was different from what she'd done in Philadelphia. Larger quantities, fewer ingredients, and the understanding that the men who ate it had been doing physical labor since before dawn and didn't need food that was interesting. They needed food that was substantial. She made mistakes. She oversalted things and undercooked things, and once produced a batch of biscuits that one of the ranch hands, a good-natured young man named Pete, described as architectural in a tone that was trying to be kind. She took the criticism without flinching, which seemed to surprise people. Margaret, for her part, watched all of this with the patient assessment of someone deciding how much to invest in a new situation. She didn't volunteer warmth, but she didn't withhold help either. When Amelia made a mistake, she corrected it plainly, without ceremony. When Amelia did something well, she said so with the same plainness. It was, Amelia thought, the most honest working relationship she'd ever been in. About 10 days in, Margaret said without preamble, "You're not what I expected." They were doing laundry. Amelia's arms were already aching. "What did you expect?" "Something softer, something that would need more looking after." She worked the sheet through the wringer with practiced efficiency. Mail order arrangements usually bring women who are desperate in a way that makes them fragile. "You're desperate, but you're not fragile." "I'm fragile," Amelia said. "I'm just careful about when." Margaret looked at her then, really looked at her in a way she hadn't quite before. "My husband died 11 years ago," she said. 3 months after we came out west. I had nothing and knew no one. Cole's father took me on as housekeeper. I've been here since. I'm sorry about your husband." "I'm not." She said it flatly, without cruelty. "He wasn't a kind man. His dying was the first good thing that happened to me in 8 years. She picked up the next sheet. "I'm telling you so you understand that I know what it looks like when a woman is surviving something, and I know what it looks like when she's going to make it." Amelia looked down at Ethan, who was sitting on a folded blanket nearby, examining a wooden spoon with intense concentration. "Which am I?" "Jury's still out," Margaret said, but there was something in it that might have been the beginning of a smile. It was on the 15th day that things in town began to reach them. Pete came in from the feed store with flour and news, the way men in small frontier towns always come back with both. He dropped the flour in the kitchen and lingered in the doorway with the particular body language of someone who doesn't want to say something but knows he should. "There's talk," he said to Margaret, and looked sideways at Amelia. "There's always talk," Margaret said. "What kind?" "About Mrs. Whitaker." He said it to the floor. "About why she's here. Some folks are saying that she tricked the system, got Cowboy to pay her fare, and then showed up with a baby she didn't mention." The kitchen went still. Amelia kept her hands moving in the dishwater. "I mentioned Ethan in every letter I wrote him. I have them. I kept copies." Pete nodded unhappily. "I believe you, ma'am, but Calloway's telling it different." Of course he was. He'd spent 4 months building a correspondence with a woman he intended to reject, and now he needed a story that made him the reasonable one. She understood the logic exactly. It was the logic of men who make choices and need someone else to be at fault for the consequences. "What else?" Margaret asked. She was looking at Pete with the face that meant, "Don't protect us from information we need." Pete shifted. "They're saying Cole shouldn't have taken her in, that it's going to bring trouble. Mrs. Daly at the boarding house is saying that a woman who couldn't keep her first husband alive probably isn't someone decent folks should be associating with." The water in the basin had gone cold. Amelia didn't notice until that moment. A woman who couldn't keep her first husband alive. She stood very still with her hands in the cold water and let that sentence move through her. It was the kind of thing that was designed to find the part of her that already blamed herself. And there was such a part, she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Those first weeks after Thomas died, she'd run through every decision, every moment where she might have done something differently, gotten the doctor sooner, noticed something she hadn't noticed, been somehow more or better.
Grief did that. It turned itself inward until you couldn't tell the difference between responsibility and torture. She had, eventually, stopped. Not because she'd decided she was blameless, but because Ethan needed her to be functional, and she couldn't be functional and also be spending all her energy on self-condemnation. So she'd put it away. She'd made it small. Mrs. Daly had just made it large again. "Thank you for telling me," Amelia said. She pulled her hands out of the water and dried them. "I appreciate it." Pete nodded, relieved to have it done with, and went back out. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You didn't kill your husband." "No," Amelia said. "I didn't." "Then it's gossip from a woman who rents rooms and has nothing better to fill her time with." "It's gossip that's going to follow me," Amelia said, "and follow Cole for taking me in. You should stay exactly where you are until you have a real plan," Margaret said, with a firmness that closed the subject. "Running because someone said something cruel is exactly what they expect you to do." Amelia looked at her. "You sound like you've thought about this before." "I've thought about it many times." She picked up Ethan from the blanket and settled him on her hip with the ease of a woman who had raised children, even if she didn't talk about it. "Sit down, eat something. When Cole gets back, we'll talk." Cole got back at supper. He sat down and ate half his plate before he said, "Heard there's talk in town." "Pete told us," Margaret said. He looked at Amelia. She was waiting for, she wasn't sure what. An apology. A suggestion that she might be better off moving on after all. Some version of what she'd been hearing her whole life, which was that she was regrettably too complicated to be worth the trouble. "Calloway's been running his mouth at the feed store," Cole said. "Says you misrepresented yourself." "I have every letter I sent him," Amelia said. "Copies. I mentioned Ethan in the second letter and everyone after." "I figured." He pushed his fork through his beans. "So you have proof?" "Yes." "Good." He went back to eating. "Keep it." She waited. "That's all?" He looked up. "What else would there be?" "I thought you might be reconsidering the arrangement, given the talk." Cole set his fork down. He had the expression of a man choosing words with care, not because he was unsure of them, but because he wanted them to land correctly. "Mrs. Whitaker, I didn't offer you a place here because I expected it to be without complications. I offered it because it was the right thing to do, and I don't generally undo right things because other people find them inconvenient." He picked his fork back up. "The talk will either die or it won't. Either way, you're not going anywhere until you have somewhere real to go." Margaret said nothing. She was watching the beans. Ethan, from his blanket on the floor, made a sound of either agreement or digestion. It was hard to tell. Amelia looked down at her own plate. Her hands were not shaking, which was something. "I want to learn to ride," she said. Cole looked up again. "What?" "A horse. I want to learn. If I'm going to be any use out here, or anywhere west of the Mississippi, I can't be dependent on wagons." She looked at him steadily. "I know it's not part of the arrangement. I'll fit it around my other work. But if you're willing to teach me, I'd like to learn." He considered her for a moment. There was something in his face that was harder to read than the rest of him, a kind of reassessment, like he was updating a calculation. "Saturday mornings," he said, "before the hands are up. Easier that way." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "It's harder than it looks, and you're going to fall off." "I've fallen off plenty of things," Amelia said. And that was where they left it, on something that wasn't quite friendship, but was some small new agreement between two people who had each, in their separate ways, learned that depending on people was dangerous, but that going entirely alone was worse. Outside, the desert had gone dark and cold. Inside the kitchen, Ethan was making small exploring sounds on his blanket, turning the wooden spoon over in his hands like it contained some mystery he was determined to unlock. Margaret was washing the supper dishes. Cole had gone out to check the horses. Amelia cleared the table and thought about letters she still carried, about a man who had shown her photograph to strangers and laughed, about a town that had watched her stand on a platform and done nothing. She thought about Saturday mornings and horses and the precise, specific satisfaction of learning something difficult. She was not all right. She was a long way from all right. But she was inside, and warm, and her son was safe, and tomorrow there would be work to do. That was enough to start with. She picked up Ethan from the blanket and pressed her face into his hair and stood there a moment in the kitchen lamplight, holding him, and did not allow herself to cry. Not because crying was weakness, but because she'd learned by now that there was a time for it, and this was not the time. The time would come when she could afford it. For now, she had work. She fell off the horse on the first Saturday. Not dramatically. There was no throw, no spook, no moment of sudden terror. The mare simply shifted her weight to the left when Amelia shifted hers to the right. And the next thing Amelia knew, she was sitting in the cold dirt of the corral with the breath knocked clean out of her body, looking up at the horse's mild, incurious face. Cole was at the fence. He didn't rush over. "You all right?" he called. She took inventory. Hands, knees, dignity. The last one questionable. "Yes," she said, and stood up before she'd entirely decided her legs were ready for it. "Good," he said. "Get back on." She wanted to say something cutting to that. She thought about it for a full 3 seconds. Then she took the stirrup and hauled herself back up, jaw tight, and the mare stood perfectly still this time as if the whole episode had been a test, and Amelia had just barely passed it. Cole watched her settle into the saddle. "Your weight's too far back. You're riding like you're trying not to fall off." "I am trying not to fall off." "That's the problem." He came into the corral and adjusted her left foot in the stirrup with the impersonal efficiency of a man correcting a mechanical error. Nothing personal about it. "You ride defensive. The horse feels it. Rides defensive back. You have to commit." "Commit to what exactly?" "To being on the horse." He stepped back. "Again, walk her around the fence." It was not elegant. It was not what she would have called progress, exactly. It was more like a slow, grinding negotiation between her body and the animals, two parties who had not yet agreed on the terms. But by the end of the second hour, she was walking the mare in something approaching a straight line without gripping the saddle horn, and Cole had said, "Better," twice, which Margaret later told her was the equivalent of enthusiastic praise. She came in from the corral that Saturday morning with dirt on her coat and a bruise forming on her left hip, and something else she couldn't name right away. A tightness in her chest that wasn't pain. It took her until she was washing her hands at the kitchen basin to identify it. It was wanting, the specific sharp wanting of someone who has discovered something difficult that they intend to master. She hadn't felt that in a long time. Ethan was on Margaret's lap at the kitchen table, being fed something mashed and beige that he was examining with deep suspicion before accepting it. He looked up when Amelia came in, and his face did the thing it did. That whole body lightening like a lamp turned up. And she crossed the room and kissed the top of his head, and then stood there a second longer than she needed to, just breathing him in. "How bad was it?" Margaret asked. "I fell off once." "Only once is actually quite good." "That's what I told myself." Amelia sat down across from them and pulled off her boot to check her ankle, which was fine, just tender. "He doesn't give much instruction. Mostly he watches and then says what's wrong." "That's how he taught himself everything," Margaret said. "He assumes it works for other people." "Does it?" Margaret fed Ethan another spoonful. "Sometimes. Depends on the person." She paused. "You went back on the horse after you fell." "He told me to." "Plenty of people don't when they're told to. They find a reason." She said it without emphasis, just as a fact she was handing over. Cole noticed. Amelia looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because he told Pete you were going to be fine." Margaret wiped Ethan's chin. For Cole, that's a speech. The second week she didn't fall off at all, which she chose not to celebrate out loud because she had the sense that celebrating the absence of falling off a horse was not something the frontier particularly respected. Instead, she asked Cole at the end of the lesson whether she could start learning to handle the mare on her own. Feeding, brushing, getting her ready. He looked at her with that measuring expression. "Why?" "Because if I'm going to ride, I should know the whole thing, not just the part where I sit on top." He thought about it. "Tomorrow morning. I'll show you once." He showed her once. She paid attention the way she'd learned to pay attention to things that mattered, but completely, without trying to look like she was paying attention. She learned where the mare was comfortable being touched and where she wasn't. She learned the way the animal's ears moved when she was relaxed versus when something had put her on edge. She learned that horses had opinions, specific and stubborn ones, and that managing those opinions required a combination of patience and consistency that was not, she thought, entirely unlike managing people. The mare's name was Dust. Cole had named her, which seemed like a very Cole Walker kind of name for a horse. Not romantic, not sentimental, purely descriptive. The horse was a pale gray that was almost white, and in the early morning light she did look like something that might dissolve. Amelia started talking to her. Not baby talk, not the cooing she'd heard other women use with animals, but actual conversation, low and quiet while she worked. She talked about Thomas sometimes, which she didn't do with people. She talked about Philadelphia and the particular smell of the street outside their apartment in spring. She talked about Ethan, about what she wanted for him, which was not what her own mother had wanted for her. Not safety at the price of smallness, but something wider. She didn't know yet what it looked like out here. She was starting to think it might be possible. She talked about Robert Calloway exactly once. She said his name out loud to the horse and then was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I'm going to be glad it happened. I'm not there yet, but I'm going to be." Dust swiveled an ear back and then forward again. "Fair enough," Amelia said. The talk in town had not died. If anything, in the third week, it sharpened. She knew this because Margaret went into Red Hollow for supplies on a Wednesday and came back quieter than usual, which was saying something. She put the supplies away with more precision than the task required, which was Margaret's version of agitation. Amelia waited. "Calloway went to see Sheriff Briggs," Margaret said finally. She was facing the shelf, not Amelia. "He's claiming you came to town under false pretenses, that the advertisement specified a widow without dependents." Amelia went very still. "I have the advertisement. I kept it. It said nothing about dependents. I also have copies of every letter I sent him." "I know," Margaret turned around. "But Calloway has friends and money, and you have—" "Paper," Amelia said. "I have paper." Margaret sat down at the kitchen table, which she almost never did in the middle of the day. It told Amelia more about the situation than the words had. "There's a lawyer in Red Hollow. Name of Ferris, not much, but he knows the law well enough for a frontier town. He's handled land claims, contract disputes. I can't afford a lawyer. Cole can." Amelia set down the dish she was holding very carefully. "No." "Amelia, no," she said again. "I am not going to let Cole Walker pay a lawyer to defend me from a man who rejected me. I will find another way." Margaret looked at her with the expression that meant she had an opinion she was deciding whether to share. She shared it. "Your pride is going to make this harder than it needs to be." "Maybe," Amelia said, "but it's mine and I'm keeping it." That evening, after Ethan was down and Margaret had gone to her room, Amelia sat at the kitchen table with her letters spread out in front of her. She read them in order. All 9 she'd sent Robert Calloway. All 9 copies she'd had the foresight to keep when some instinct had told her to trust paper more than promises. She read her own words and felt the strange double consciousness of reading something from a version of yourself that still believed in a different outcome. In the second letter, clearly, "I should mention that I have a son, Ethan James, who is 4 months old. He is the reason I am seeking a new life, and I would not have it otherwise. I understand this changes things, and I want you to make your decision with full knowledge. In the third, I want to be very clear about Ethan, as I think honesty is the only fair beginning. He is healthy, good-tempered, and I love him more than anything in this life. Any arrangement would include him. If this is not acceptable, please let me know now rather than later." She had been clearer than she needed to be. She had practically dared him to say no early. And instead, he had kept writing, kept the correspondence going through 3 more months, let her sell everything she owned, let her buy a ticket, and then put a letter in the hands of a station boy. She gathered the copies into a neat stack and tied them with the string she'd used to secure them in her trunk and sat there with her hands flat on the table. She was going to need to take care of this herself. Not because she was too proud to accept help. She had accepted Cole's help and Margaret's help and was accepting it still. But because the habit of letting other people solve her problems was the same habit that had left her standing on that platform.
She needed to understand her own situation clearly enough to defend it herself. She went to find Cole. He was in the small room he used as an office, going over the account ledgers by lamplight. He looked up when she knocked on the open door. "Margaret told you," she said. "This afternoon." He set his pen down. "Sit down." She sat in the chair across the desk from him. The chair, she noticed, that was positioned for someone he was talking to rather than someone he was doing business with. That told her something, though she wasn't sure what yet. "I want to know exactly what Calloway told Briggs," she said. "Not the softened version. The exact version." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "He says the advertisement he placed specified a woman without children, that you either misread it or deliberately misrepresented yourself. He's asking Briggs to investigate whether you have a claim against his paid fare. He wants the ticket money back. That's part of it." "What's the other part?" Cole looked at her steadily. "He wants you gone from the territory. He's got a particular embarrassment about the whole thing now. He's trying to control how the story ends." Amelia thought about that. A man who'd shown her photograph to strangers in a feed store, laughing, and now he was embarrassed. "The advertisement said a widow," she said. "Not a widow without children. The word widow by itself means a woman whose husband has died. It says nothing about her situation beyond that." "I know." "And I told him about Ethan in the second letter." "I know." "So he's lying." Cole said simply, "Yes." She looked at her hands on her knees. "I need to speak to Sheriff Briggs myself, with the letters." Cole leaned back in his chair. It creaked. Everything in this house creaked. It was how you knew it was inhabited. Briggs is a reasonable man. He's not going to pursue something without evidence, but Calloway's going to keep pushing if he doesn't get a response. "Then he'll get a response," Amelia said. "From me, not from a lawyer, not from you." She looked up. "I need to do this one myself." He studied her for a long moment. She had the feeling he was deciding whether to argue and deciding against it. "I'll take you in Thursday morning," he said. "Briggs's office is on the main street, South End. I can find it. You can ride Dust in if you feel ready." She almost said, "I'm not ready," out of reflex, and then she stopped because it wasn't true. She was ready. She was better on that horse than she'd expected to be by now, and riding in herself, not in Cole's wagon, not as a passenger, was a different thing entirely. "All right," she said. "Thursday." She went back to the kitchen and sat there a while longer in the quiet, and did not feel afraid exactly. She felt the particular mix of dread and readiness that she was beginning to understand was just what it felt like to be about to do something necessary. Thursday came gray and cold. She put on the best dress she'd brought from Philadelphia, the dark blue wool with the good buttons, and pinned her hair carefully because she understood that how a woman looked when she walked into a frontier sheriff's office alone would be part of the argument before she said a word. She put the letters in her coat pocket. She kissed Ethan, who was in Margaret's arms on the porch. "You'll be fine," Margaret said. "I know," Amelia said. She wasn't certain that was true. She said it anyway. She rode Dust into Red Hollow with her back straight and her weight forward the way Cole had taught her, committing to each step, and the horse moved under her with the steady rhythm that she'd been learning to trust. It was 2 miles to the main street, long enough to think about what she was going to say, long enough to decide that what she was going to say was, essentially, the truth in the clearest language she could manage, and she would let the letters do the rest. The people on the main street watched her ride in. She recognized the watching. It was the same watching as the platform, the same curiosity that didn't get close enough to help. Only now she was on horseback, and she held the reins with steady hands, and she looked straight ahead. Sheriff Briggs' office was exactly where Cole said. She hitched Dust to the post outside and went in. Briggs was a lean man in his 50s with careful eyes and a neat desk that told her he was more organized than the average frontier lawman. He looked up when she came in, and his expression shifted in the way she'd learned to watch for the quick recalibration when someone finds the situation different from what they expected. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. He knew who she was. Of course he did. "Sheriff Briggs?"
She sat down across from him without being invited to, because waiting to be invited established a particular dynamic she didn't want. I understand Mr. Calloway has spoken with you about me. He has. I'd like to respond to whatever he told you. I have documentation. She pulled the letters from her pocket and set them on his desk, the stack neat and tied. Copies of every letter I sent Mr. Calloway. You'll find that Ethan, my son, is mentioned in the second letter, 4 months before I arrived. Mr. Calloway's claim that I misrepresented myself is either a confusion or a lie. I leave it to you to determine which. Briggs looked at the stack of letters. He didn't touch them yet. He claims the advertisement specified no dependents. The advertisement specified widow. I have that too. She produced it. She'd kept everything, every scrap of paper from the whole transaction, and laid it beside the letters. There's no language about children or dependents. The word widow means a woman whose husband has died, which I am. Briggs was quiet for a moment. He picked up the advertisement and read it. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A slight relaxation, the kind that happens when a man realizes a thing is simpler than he was told. Mrs. Whitaker, he said carefully, I want to be honest with you. Mr. Calloway is a landowner of some standing in this county. He's not someone I can dismiss without cause. I'm not asking you to dismiss him. I'm asking you to read the letters and look at the advertisement and tell me whether there's a legal basis for what he's claiming. She met his eyes and held them. Is there? He looked at her for a long moment, a lawman's look, assessing, not unkind. No, he said, on what you've shown me, there isn't. She breathed out slowly. Then I'd appreciate it if you conveyed that to Mr. Calloway. I'll do that. She stood. Briggs stood with her, which was something. A small courtesy that meant he'd landed somewhere in her favor. She picked up the letters but left the advertisement on his desk. You can keep that, she said, in case he comes back. She was at the door when he said, Mrs. Whitaker. She turned. You'd have been wasted on Calloway, he said, with the flat certainty of a man stating a fact. She didn't know what to do with that, so she nodded once and went back out to dust. She rode back to the Walker Ranch at a canter, which was faster than she'd attempted before. And the wind pulled at her hair and Dust's hooves beat a steady percussion against the packed earth, and she did not fall off, and she did not cry. And by the time she turned onto the ranch road, something in her chest had loosened by exactly one notch. Not resolved, not healed, just slightly less tight than before. Margaret was still on the porch with Ethan when she rode in. She hitched Dust and came up the steps and took her son from Margaret's arms and stood there holding him. Well, Margaret said. Briggs says Calloway doesn't have a case. Margaret made a sound that might have been satisfaction. Good. Cole appeared from the direction of the barn, dust on his hands from whatever he'd been doing. He looked at her face first, before anything else, with that particular attention of his. How did it go? He asked. Fine, she said. I handled it. He nodded. No excessive reaction, no, I told you so, or I'm proud of you, or any of the things men sometimes said to women who had done something that was simply their own business to do. Just the nod. She was beginning to understand this was his highest form of respect. Lunch is ready, Margaret said, and that was apparently the end of the chapter. But it wasn't entirely the end because word travels in a small town the way water finds its own level, around obstacles, under doors, through whatever opening is available. By the following week, the nature of the talk had shifted. Not stopped. It never entirely stopped in a place like Red Hollow, but shifted. The version where Amelia Whitaker had tricked the mail-order system was harder to sustain now that Briggs had quietly told 3 or 4 people of influence that he'd looked into it and there was nothing to it. What replaced it was something she found, in some ways, harder to manage. People started being curious about her. A woman named Helen Pruitt, who ran the dry goods store with her husband Frank, stopped Margaret one afternoon and asked, with the careful casualness of genuine curiosity rather than gossip, how Mrs. Whitaker was getting on. A ranch wife named Clara Boone, who had reason to come by the Walker property about a fencing matter, stayed for coffee and spent 20 minutes watching Amelia with Ethan with an expression that softened steadily as the visit went on. The feed store owner's wife sent over a jar of preserves with no note, which Margaret said was how people out here apologized without apologizing. Amelia accepted all of it without making too much of it. She understood that the goodwill was provisional, that it was attached to her behavior and could be withdrawn, and she understood that she was still, in most of Red Hollow's estimation, on probation. She kept working. That was the thing she knew how to do. She got better at the cooking, which took stubbornness more than talent. She got better on dust, which took the same. Margaret began teaching her the accounts, not because she'd asked, but because Margaret had apparently decided she was trustworthy enough with numbers, which was how Margaret assigned trust. Not with warmth, but with responsibility. She taught Amelia how to track costs, how to negotiate with suppliers, how to identify when a bill was wrong, and how to say so without apology. "You have a good head for figures," Margaret told her one evening, going over the month's ledger. "My husband used to say I was better at the money than he was," Amelia said. "He wasn't wrong. He was good at a lot of things. Saving money wasn't one of them." "Thomas," Margaret said. She only used the name occasionally, never with sentiment, just acknowledgement that the person had existed and mattered. "Thomas," Amelia agreed. She talked about him more easily now, which surprised her. Not because the grief was gone. She didn't think it went entirely. She thought you just built the rest of your life bigger until it occupied a proportionate space. But because she was far enough from the acute part that she could hold him in her mind without the specific sharpness of it. He'd been a decent man with a funny laugh and a bad habit of underestimating how long things would take. He'd loved her in the practical, daily way that doesn't make good stories, but makes good lives. She missed him. She was also alive, which required attending to. Cole was in the barn that evening when she went to check on Dust, which she did every evening now as a matter of course. He was mending a piece of harness in the lamplight and looked up when she came in. "Margaret says you've taken to the accounts," he said. "She told you?" "She doesn't tell me things often. When she does, I pay attention." Amelia settled on the stool near Dust's stall, and the mare turned her head to look at her with those patient dark eyes. "She's a good teacher. Doesn't repeat herself unless you need it." "No," Cole said. "She doesn't." He worked the leather through his hands. "How are you doing, actually?" She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was focused on the harness, which she'd learned was how he asked things he thought might be too direct to ask face to face. "Honestly?" She thought about it. "Better than I expected. Worse than I want to be. Somewhere in the middle of figuring out what comes next." "What does come next, if you've thought about it?" She had thought about it. She'd been thinking about it since the first night in the small room off the kitchen, turning it over in her mind the way you turn a problem over until the shape of it becomes familiar. "I don't want to go back east," she said. "I thought I might. When I was on that platform in Red Hollow with the letter in my hand, I thought this was over. But I don't want to go back." She stroked Dust's nose. "There's something here. I don't mean this ranch. I mean out here. The space of it. The fact that nobody has already decided who you are before you open your mouth." "They decide pretty fast," Cole said dryly. "They try," she allowed, "but it doesn't stick the same way. Back east, Philadelphia, I was Thomas Whitaker's widow, and I was going to be Thomas Whitaker's widow until I died, and Ethan was going to be Thomas Whitaker's son who didn't have a father, and those stories were going to follow us everywhere we went." She paused. "Out here I could be something else. I don't know what yet, but the possibility feels real." Cole was quiet for a while, working the harness. The barn was warm with the smell of horse and hay and lantern oil. "My father homesteaded this land," he said eventually. "Came out in 1848 with nothing and built it from rocks and stubbornness. Died of exhaustion in 1869 because that's what this land does to people who love it too much and don't pace themselves." He set the harness down. "He always said the West doesn't care about your past. Doesn't care about what you were or where you came from. It just cares about what you do with the day you're in." "Do you believe that?" He considered it honestly, which she appreciated. He didn't give her the easy version. "Mostly," he said. "Not entirely. People bring themselves with them. But the land doesn't come with opinions already formed. That part's true." She looked at him in the lamplight. He was a private man. She understood that clearly by now. The kind of private that comes not from secrecy,
but from a long habit of self-sufficiency, of having learned that most things were better handled alone because other people were unreliable. She understood the logic completely because she'd been building the same habit. It occurred to her that they were, in some ways, the same kind of person. Not in the obvious ways. She was an Eastern woman with a baby, and he was a rancher who'd been in this desert his whole adult life. But in the deeper structure of it, the self-sufficiency with the loneliness underneath it that you didn't talk about because talking about it didn't fix it. "I should let you finish," she said. "You're not bothering me." It was said simply, without any particular weight, but it landed with weight anyway. She filed it away next to "only once" is actually quite good, and he told Pete you were going to be fine. The small, unornamented things he said that meant more than they appeared to. She stayed another few minutes, talking to dust while Cole worked, and the night outside pressed up against the barn walls, and somewhere in the house Ethan was sleeping in his crate of quilts, and the day's tension, Calloway, Briggs, the letters, the canter home, had settled into something manageable. She was tired. She was genuinely bone-deep tired, in a way she hadn't let herself feel since she'd arrived, too busy surviving to notice. She said goodnight and went inside, and she lay in the small cedar room and listened to the desert wind, and she thought, I am not going back. It wasn't a decision exactly. It was more like a recognition. The moment when you realize the deciding was done some time ago and you'd just been waiting for yourself to catch up. She closed her eyes. Down the hall, Ethan breathed in his small, steady rhythm. Outside, the desert did whatever it did at night, enormous and indifferent and full of possibility that had nothing to do with who you used to be. She slept. The decision not to go back east turned out to be the easy part. What came after it, the actual daily business of building a life out of the decision, was considerably harder, and Amelia had known enough disappointment by now to expect that. She didn't expect it to be easy. She just hadn't anticipated all the specific shapes the difficulty would take. The first shape was Ethan getting sick. It happened on a Tuesday in the 6th week, quietly and without drama. The way real illness usually comes, not with the sudden violence of emergency, but with a gradual wrongness that takes a few hours to name. He was fussier than usual in the morning, pulling at his ear, rejecting the food he normally accepted without complaint. By afternoon, he had a fever. By evening, it was high enough that Amelia was sitting on the edge of her bed with him in her lap, and her hand pressed to his forehead, and a fear moving through her that was specific and total, and had nothing to do with Arizona or Robert Calloway or any of the external architecture of her current troubles. It was the fear that had been living in her since April of the previous year, when Thomas had spiked a fever on a Thursday and been dead by the following Tuesday. She knew the difference between a baby's ear fever and the lung fever that had killed her husband. She knew it intellectually. She was sitting there at 10 o'clock at night knowing it intellectually with absolute certainty while her body ignored everything she knew and went ahead and panicked anyway. Margaret appeared in the doorway. She looked at Amelia's face and then at Ethan and came into the room without being invited and put her own hand on the baby's forehead. "Ear," she said after a moment. "I think so too. There's a doctor in Harker's Crossing, 20 miles east. But ear fever in a baby his age usually breaks on its own in 2 or 3 days if you keep him cool and fed." She looked at Amelia steadily. "Is this like something you've seen before with him?" "Not like Thomas," Amelia said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I know it's not like Thomas." Margaret sat down on the edge of the bed next to her. It was the closest physical proximity she'd permitted since the day Amelia arrived, and it communicated more than any words Margaret was likely to produce. "Then we watch him tonight. I'll sit the first half, you sleep. You're not useful to him exhausted." "I can't sleep." "I know. Try anyway." She didn't sleep. She dozed in the chair in the corner of the room while Margaret sat with Ethan, and the night moved slowly around them, and at 3 in the morning the fever broke with a rush of sweat, and Ethan made a small complaining sound, and then settled into the deep, easy sleep of an infant whose body has finished fighting something. Amelia pressed her face against the side of the crate and cried, briefly, with the silent efficiency of someone releasing pressure before the vessel fails. Margaret, across the room, pretended not to notice. That was its own form of kindness. By morning, Ethan was cranky but cooler.
working at a piece of bread with his two new teeth, and regarding the world with the affronted expression of someone who has been through something and expects compensation. Amelia fed him breakfast with shaking hands and the residual trembling of a night's worth of fear finally metabolizing into something manageable. Cole appeared at the kitchen door at 6, which was his normal hour, and looked at her face and then at Ethan. "Bad night?" "Ear fever," Amelia said. "He's fine now." He poured his coffee and stood at the counter drinking it, and she felt him making a decision the way you feel weather changing. Not dramatically, just a shift in pressure. "There's a doctor in Harker's Crossing," he said. "I know it's 20 miles, but if it happens again—" "Margaret told me," she said. "I'll remember." He nodded. "You should eat something." "I will." He looked at her for another moment. That specific look of his that was not intrusive but was thorough, like he was checking a calculation. Then he put his cup down and went out to start the day's work, and Amelia sat at the table with Ethan on her knee and ate a piece of bread she didn't taste and thought, "I cannot do this alone. I also cannot stop." Both things were true at once. She was learning that the frontier ran on exactly this kind of irresolvable contradiction, and that the only response to it was to keep moving anyway. The second shape the difficulty took arrived in mid-February, and this one was not internal. Cole came back from Red Hollow on a Friday with feed and a new tension in the set of his jaw that Amelia recognized by now. She was in the corral working dust when he pulled the wagon in, and she rode over to the fence and waited while he unhitched the team with the focused efficiency of a man doing something with his hands because his mind is occupied elsewhere. "What happened?" she said. He looked up. He still wasn't used to her reading him that accurately. She could see the small startlement of it cross his face. "Nothing certain yet," he said. "Come find me after supper." After supper, after Margaret took Ethan, Cole spread a hand-drawn map on the kitchen table and showed her. The Walker Ranch was in the lower left corner. Directly to the southwest was a parcel marked with hatching, unregistered land that Cole had been using for winter grazing for 6 years with the understanding, informal and unwritten, that it was available to neighboring ranchers who needed it. "Somebody's filed on it," he said. Amelia looked at the map. "Filed a claim?" "A land claim, yes. Posted notices in Red Hollow 2 days ago. I didn't see them until today." He traced the boundary with his finger. "This parcel here. If someone builds on it and establishes use, they cut off my southwest water access. There's a creek that runs through the corner. In dry season, it's the only reliable water for the south pasture." "Who filed?" He was quiet for a moment. "The name on the notice is a man called Denton. Silas Denton. Nobody in Red Hollow knows him personally. He came in about 3 weeks ago, paid cash for a room at the Miner's Rest, and has been going around asking questions about land boundaries." "Asking who?" "Frank Pruitt at the dry goods, the surveyor's office." He paused. "And Robert Calloway." The kitchen was quiet. The fire ticked. Amelia looked at the map and thought about what it meant that a stranger had arrived in Red Hollow 3 weeks ago. Around the same time Briggs had told Calloway there was no legal basis for his claims against her, and had immediately begun asking about land boundaries with apparent focus on the southwest quarter. "Calloway hired him," she said. "I don't know that." "You think it." Cole looked at her. "I think it's possible. Calloway has money. He has reason to want to make things difficult for me, and through me for you. If Denton files legitimately on that parcel, I can't stop him. The water access issue becomes a long legal problem." He folded his hands on the table. "But if Denton is acting as a proxy for Calloway, if Calloway is bankrolling the claim in exchange for some agreement about the land use, that's a different matter." "Can you prove it?" "Not yet." "Then we need to find out." She said it before she'd entirely thought it through, the "we" coming out naturally in a way she noticed even as she said it. Cole noticed it too. She could tell by the slight pause before he responded. "I've written to my lawyer in Tucson," he said, "Bert Haynes. He handles land matters. He'll come out and look at the situation." "How long will that take?" 10 days, 2 weeks. And in the meantime, Denton is still on that land? He's posted notices, he hasn't broken ground yet." Cole looked at the map again. "There are 3 other ranchers who use that southwest parcel for seasonal grazing. The Garver brothers, Tom Ridley, and old Seth Marsh. If Denton builds and claims water rights, they're affected too. Amelia looked at him. Have you talked to them? Not yet. You should, she said. You don't need a lawyer to have a conversation with your neighbors about a shared problem. He was quiet again in that way that meant he was re-examining something. No, he said finally. I don't. She looked at the map for another moment and then said something she'd been holding for a few weeks, waiting for the right time, though she wasn't sure this was it. Cole, I want to know, is any of this because of me? Calloway's anger at you, the business with Denton. Would this be happening if I wasn't here? He looked at her with a directness that was almost startling from a man who usually communicated through indirection and careful economy. Calloway's been looking for a reason to make trouble for me for 2 years, he said. We had a water dispute in 1874. Before you ever existed to him. You gave him a fresh grievance, but the old one was already there. He paused. You're not the cause of this. Don't take that on. She believed him. She wasn't entirely sure she should believe him, but she did. The next 10 days were the most complex she'd experienced at the ranch, and that was saying something given what the previous 6 weeks had contained. Cole rode out to the Garver brothers' place on Saturday, and to Tom Ridley's on Sunday, and came back from each visit with the measured but visible satisfaction of a man who has found his neighbors to be more reasonable than he feared. The Garvers were immediately angry in the loud, uncomplicated way of men whose family had been working the same land for 20 years and didn't take kindly to boundary disruption. Ridley was quieter, but no less firm. Seth Marsh was a different matter. Seth was 81 years old and had been on his land since before Arizona was a territory. He was also, according to Margaret, not entirely predictable in his old age. There were days when he was as sharp as he'd ever been, and days when he was somewhere else entirely. Cole came back from Seth's place on Monday looking thoughtful in a way that was more worry than satisfaction. He was having a good day, Cole said. He understood the situation, but he said something I need to think about. What did he say? He said Denton came to see him. Cole sat at the kitchen table. 2 weeks ago, before the notices went up. He brought a bottle of whiskey and spent 2 hours talking to Seth about the old days, and at some point in the conversation, Seth apparently signed a paper. The kitchen went very still. What kind of paper? Amelia said. Seth doesn't entirely remember. He said it looked like a letter of some kind, a statement. He thought he was signing something about his own land use history, documentation for the historical record, Denton told him. But it wasn't. I don't know what it was. Cole's jaw was tight. I need to see it, but Denton has it, and Seth doesn't have a copy. Amelia thought about this carefully. She thought about old men and whiskey and strangers who come with flattery and documents and the particular vulnerability of someone who has been alone long enough that company feels like a gift. She thought about Thomas's father, who in the last years of his life had been taken advantage of by exactly this kind of calculated attention, and about the particular cruelty of people who looked at the elderly and saw not persons, but instruments. Is there anyone Seth trusts absolutely? She said. Family? Old neighbors? His son is in California. Haven't heard from him in years. Cole rubbed his face. There's Margaret, actually. She's known Seth since before I was born. Amelia looked at the hallway. Does she know about this? Not yet. She went to find Margaret. Margaret, when told, did not produce the kind of outrage Amelia expected. She went very quiet in the particular way that meant she was doing something more serious than being angry. She was thinking. She stood in the kitchen doorway for almost a full minute without speaking. I'll go see Seth tomorrow, she said. I'll come with you, Amelia said. Margaret looked at her. You and Seth have never met. That's fine. You go in first, but I'd like to come. She didn't explain further. She wasn't sure she could explain it, only that sitting at the ranch and waiting while other people handled things was not something she was capable of anymore, and hadn't been for some weeks. Margaret studied her for a moment and then said, All right, early. Seth Marsh's place was 8 miles west, a small homestead that had the look of land that had been loved hard for a long time.
The house was old, and the fences were old, and everything had the weathered, particular quality of things that were still standing entirely through stubbornness and history. Seth himself answered the door in his boots and his suspenders, with his white hair uncombed, and his face when he saw Margaret lit up in a way that was both affecting and a little heartbreaking, the brightness of someone who doesn't get many visitors. "Maggie," he said. He always called her Maggie. She'd once mentioned it with an expression that suggested she allowed it from very few people. "And who's this?" "Amelia Whitaker," Margaret said. "She's been staying at Cole's place." Seth looked at Amelia with the frank appraisal of a very old man who has stopped pretending to be subtle.
"You're the one Calloway left on the platform," he said. She was becoming accustomed to being identified this way. "That's me," she said. He nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already decided. "Come in." The inside of Seth's house was the inside of a long life, layered and dense with accumulated objects, none of it tidy, but none of it careless either. He made them coffee with the careful deliberateness of someone whose hands had developed their own ideas about speed, and they sat at his table with the February light coming in the windows, and Margaret handled the initial conversation with the skill of a woman who had done delicate things before. She brought Denton up gradually. Seth's face changed when the name came up. Not quite alarm, but a kind of shadow. "The paper," Amelia said gently. "Do you remember anything specific about what it said? Even a few words?" Seth thought about it. His hands moved on his coffee cup. "It had my name at the top, and it said something about the parcel, the Southwest parcel, the one we all use. I thought it was about my years of use there, my history with the land." "Did it say anything about rights?" Amelia asked, "or about who had priority use?" He thought harder. His eyes went inward, that particular inward focus of old age trying to recover something. "There was a line," he said slowly, about acknowledging that the land was unclaimed, unoccupied." Margaret and Amelia looked at each other. "Seth," Amelia said carefully, "I think that paper may have been a statement saying that the Southwest parcel had no established users, which would make it easier for Denton to file a clean claim." Seth was very still. Then something moved across his face. Not confusion, but the specific and terrible lucidity of a man who has just understood that he was deceived. It was a hard thing to watch. Amelia had seen it before, that expression, and it never got easier. "He told me it was for the record," Seth said. He said it quietly, without anger yet, just the flat tone of someone taking stock. "He said it was for history." "I know," Amelia said. "He lied to you." Seth's jaw tightened. He looked at Margaret. "Can it be undone?" "That's what Cole's lawyer needs to answer," Margaret said. "But your testimony about how you were misled, that's worth something. That's evidence of fraud." "I'd testify," he said immediately. No hesitation, which told Amelia more about who Seth Marsh was than the whole previous hour had. "I'd say it to anyone who needed to hear it. I signed that paper because I was told it was one thing and it was another. That's not my mistake. That's his crime." She wanted to reach across the table and take his hand, but wasn't sure he'd want that. So instead she said, "We'll make sure that's known." They rode back to the Walker Ranch with more than they'd gone out with, which was the best possible result of the kind of conversation they'd just had. Amelia was quiet most of the way, turning what she'd learned over in her mind. The scheme had a certain ruthless efficiency to it. Find the oldest and most isolated landowner in the area, get a document that appeared to establish no prior use of the contested parcel, file a claim on that basis. If it worked, Denton had a defensible legal position. Cole's water access was gone. And somewhere behind all of it, Robert Calloway had spent money on something that looked like legitimate land development and couldn't be directly connected to his name. It was smart. She didn't want to give it that, but it was. The lawyer arrived from Tucson 9 days later. A compact man named Bert Haynes, who wore a suit that had been good once and traveled with a leather case that was entirely too heavy for its size. He had the look of a man who had spent 20 years in Western territories doing law and had developed a specific kind of patience for how slowly justice moved out here. He sat at the kitchen table that first evening and listened to everything. Cole's account, Margaret's, Amelia's notes from the visit with Seth, which she'd written out in full the evening they returned because she'd learned by now that paper was where you kept the things that mattered. When they were done, Haynes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Seth Marsh document is the key. If we can establish that Denton obtained that signature through misrepresentation, the entire foundation of his claim is compromised." He tapped the table with one finger. "I'll need to speak with Seth directly, and I'll need to look at the claim documents Denton filed." "I can get those," Cole said. "Copies are public record." "Good." He looked at Amelia. "These notes are thorough. You wrote these from memory?" "The same evening," she said, "while it was fresh." He studied her with the calculating interest of a man reassessing a situation. "You're not a party to this land claim." "No," she said. "But you've made yourself fairly central to the investigation of it." "I'm useful," she said simply. "And I had the conversation with Seth that produced the most relevant information."
I'm not going to pretend otherwise to seem appropriately modest. Something moved across Haynes's face that might have been amusement. "No," he said. "I suppose you're not." He turned back to Cole. "I'll need 4 or 5 days minimum, possibly a week." "You'll stay here," Cole said. It wasn't a question. The house was suddenly very full in a way it hadn't been. Haynes working at the kitchen table in the mornings with papers spread around him, Amelia helping where she could and staying out of the way where she couldn't, Pete and the other ranch hand Jeb moving around the property with the slightly heightened alertness of men who understood something important was happening. Margaret produced meals at regular intervals with the same unruffled consistency she brought to everything, as if lawyers appeared at the kitchen table and legal emergencies were entirely within the normal range of household management. It was on the third night of Haynes's stay that Denton appeared. Not in person, not initially, but Cole came in from the barn at 9 in the evening with a look on his face that brought Amelia out of her chair. "Pete found marks on the southwest fence line," he said. "Someone's been walking the boundary. Boot prints. The mud's still soft from yesterday's rain." Haynes looked up from his papers. "Does Denton know about the legal inquiry?" "Not from us," Cole said, "but Red Hollow talks." "He's checking what he's up against," Haynes said. He said it calmly, the tone of a man who has seen this particular maneuver before. "He wants to know how far you're willing to go." That night, Amelia was in the kitchen with Ethan when she heard something that made her go still. A sound from outside. Not the wind, not an animal, something with a different quality. Deliberate, patterned. She set Ethan in his blanket on the floor and went to the window. The night was cloud-covered, dark enough that the yard was only shapes. She stood there listening, and then she saw it. A light, small and moving, near the barn. She didn't think. She went to the shelf where Cole kept the rifle. She'd been handling it for 3 weeks now, first under his instruction, and then on her own, practicing the loading and the weight of it, the particular discipline of aiming slowly rather than quickly. She'd never fired at anything except a fence post, and she'd hit the fence post, and now she picked the rifle up and checked it the way Cole had shown her and went to the back door. Margaret materialized from the hallway. She saw Amelia's face and the rifle and went immediately to Ethan without being asked, picking him up from the floor and pressing back toward the interior of the house. Amelia opened the back door. The cold hit her. The yard was dark and still, and she stood on the step with the rifle down at her side, not raised, but held, and she looked at the barn. The light was gone. Nothing moved. She waited. Then a figure stepped out from the side of the barn and stopped. A man. Large. He hadn't seen her yet. He was looking toward the house from an angle, watching a window. She could see the silhouette of him, the hat, the heavy coat. "Stop where you are," she said. He spun toward her. The way he moved told her he hadn't expected anyone to be standing there, and certainly not a woman with a rifle. He took one step toward her, and she raised the weapon. "I said stop." He stopped. They stood there in the dark yard with 10 feet between them, and the cold and the silence and the specific quality of a moment that could go in 2 very different directions. "I'm just passing through it," he said. His voice was flat. He was not a man who spooked easily. She could hear that, but he was reassessing.
People passing through don't walk fence lines at midnight and stand outside other people's barns, she said. Who are you? He said nothing. The back door opened behind her and Cole came out, and then Haynes, and then Pete with his own rifle. The man in the yard took stock of the situation with the quick calculation of someone who has just realized the math has changed. Denton, Cole said. It wasn't a question. The man's jaw moved. Walker. You're on my land. I'm on uncontested range. That's a matter currently under legal review, Haynes said from the doorway, with the particular bland authority of a man who has learned that tone carries weight in dark yards. Silas Denton, I assume. I'm Bert Haynes, representing Mr. Walker. I'll be needing to speak with you formally about the claim documents. Tomorrow morning. Sheriff Briggs's office would be an appropriate venue. The silence stretched. I'll be there, Denton said finally. He walked away into the dark without another word. They listened to his footsteps until they were gone, and then the night was just wind again. Cole looked at Amelia. She was still holding the rifle. Her hands were steady. She noticed this and filed it away for later, the fact that her hands were steady. You came out alone, he said. Margaret had Ethan. I mean, you came out before you woke anyone. You were in your room and I was in the kitchen and he was at the barn, she said. There wasn't time for the better sequence. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read in the dark. You did right, he said finally. Holding your position and not firing. He wasn't threatening yet, she said. You don't shoot someone for standing in your yard. No, Cole said. You don't. She went inside and put the rifle back on the shelf and stood there a moment with her hands flat on the wood of the shelf, just breathing. Haynes came in and poured himself a glass of water and said, without looking at her, In 15 years of frontier law, I have never had a client's housekeeper hold a man at gunpoint before I got my boots on. I'm not his housekeeper, Amelia said. Haynes looked at her. No, he said. I can see that you're not. Margaret appeared with Ethan, who was awake now and regarding everyone with the wide, interested eyes of an infant who doesn't know what happened but understands that something did. Amelia took him and held him against her chest and felt his small, warm weight and the particular solidity of him, the fact of him. She sat down at the kitchen table and did not fall apart, which she considered a reasonable result for a woman who had just stood in a dark yard in Arizona pointing a rifle at a man she'd never met. Cole sat across from her. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, Calloway put him up to this. We know that. Tomorrow morning, with Briggs and Haynes, we're going to find out how much Denton is willing to protect him. She looked up. And if Denton won't talk, then we find another way to the truth. Cole's voice was level. That's what we do out here. We find another way. She thought about letters she'd kept, about a station master with a mustache, about an old man who'd been given whiskey and a lie, and had answered it with the plain, undecorated dignity of someone who knew right from wrong even when it cost him. All right, she said, then that's what we do. Ethan fell asleep in her arms while they sat there, the whole house quiet around them. Haynes reviewing papers, Margaret washing the cups, Cole at the table with his hands folded, and the particular expression of a man who has decided something and is waiting for morning to act on it. Outside, the desert held its enormous silence. The fence post stood in the dark. The southwest parcel, the creek, the water, the land that people had been working and sharing and depending on for years, sat waiting for morning the same way everything else was. Amelia looked at her sleeping son and thought, not this time. She had let things be taken from her before, her husband, her home, the life she'd planned. And she understood now that some of those were things that couldn't be held. But this was different. This was something that could be fought, and she was in a position to fight it, and she was not going to sit in the kitchen and wait for other people to decide how it came out. She had paper. She had testimony. She had a rifle she knew how to hold. She also had, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, people standing beside her. She stayed at the table until Cole finally said it was late and she should sleep. She went to her room and lay down with Ethan and listened to the wind and the fear she'd expected to feel. The residue of the yard and the dark and the man in the heavy coat wasn't exactly there. What was there was something harder and quieter and more useful. She closed her eyes and slept. Denton showed up at Briggs's office at 9 in the morning, which surprised everyone except Haynes, who said afterward that men who come to a meeting they've been cornered into always arrive on time because being late would mean they'd spent the night thinking about running. He was bigger in daylight than he'd seemed in the dark yard, broad through the shoulders, with the blunt, patient face of a man who made his living doing other people's difficult work and had learned not to carry it home with him. He sat across the desk from Briggs with his hat on his knee and looked at Haynes and Cole and said nothing until Briggs told him what was on the table. Haynes laid it out plainly. The land claim, the document Seth Marsh had signed, the manner in which the document had been obtained, the specific legal weight of fraud in the context of a territorial land filing. He spoke without drama, which Amelia had noticed was how the most serious legal information always landed hardest. Not dressed up, just delivered. Denton listened. His face didn't change much, but his hands on the hat brim changed. A slight tightening, then a deliberate release. "I want to know one thing," Briggs said when Haynes finished. "Did somebody put you up to this, or did you come up with it yourself?" Denton looked at the sheriff for a long moment. "I was hired," he said. Cole said nothing. Amelia, standing near the wall because there hadn't been enough chairs and she'd refused to wait outside, felt the room change in the way rooms change when something true finally enters them. "Name," Briggs said. Denton looked at the window. He looked at his hat. He went through the visible arithmetic of a man calculating what he owed to the person who'd hired him against what he owed to himself, and the calculation took about 30 seconds, which told Amelia that what Denton owed himself had been accumulating for longer than this particular arrangement. "Calloway," he said. "Robert Calloway." Briggs wrote it down. Haynes wrote it down. Cole didn't move. "He came to me in Tucson," Denton said. "Said he needed someone to handle a land matter quietly. Said there was a rancher in Red Hollow sitting on water access that Calloway wanted, and that the only way to get at it legally was to file on the southwest parcel before the other ranchers thought to establish formal claims." He paused. He said to find the weakest link, someone whose memory might not hold up. Someone who wouldn't know what they were signing. The room was very quiet. "And you knew what that meant," Briggs said. "I knew what it meant," Denton said. "I did it anyway." He said the second part without apology or performance, just fact. Whatever he wasn't a man who made excuses for himself. Amelia noted this without softening toward him. He'd still sat with Seth Marsh for 2 hours with whiskey and lies, but it was a fact about him nonetheless. Haynes had him sign a statement while Briggs witnessed it. The whole thing took 40 minutes. When it was done, Denton stood and put his hat on and looked at Cole. "For what it's worth," he said, "the old man, Marsh, he was sharp. Sharper than Calloway thought he'd be. He asked good questions. I had to work for it." Cole looked at him steadily. "That doesn't make it better." "No," Denton said. "I know it doesn't." He went out. The door closed. Briggs put his pen down and looked at the statement. "Calloway," he said, with the tone of a man who is not surprised but had hoped to be. "I'll need to look at what charges actually stick," Haynes said. "Conspiracy to commit land fraud is the strongest. The Seth Marsh document may also support charges related to obtaining a signature through deception." He closed his case. "Calloway has money, and he'll use it. This isn't going to be quick." "But it's documented," Amelia said. Everyone looked at her. She'd been quiet long enough that they'd perhaps half forgotten she was there, which she was used to. "Everything Denton just said. Signed. Witnessed. That goes on the record, and it stays there regardless of what Calloway's money does to the timeline." Haynes looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's correct." "Then we have what we came for today," she said. "Everything else is next." Cole looked at her with that expression of his she'd been cataloging for 2 months now, the one that was somewhere between reassessment and recognition, like a man repeatedly discovering that a situation is more than he initially judged it to be. Briggs sent 2 deputies to the Calloway Ranch that afternoon. Amelia heard about this from Pete, who heard about it from the feed store, which was how information moved in Red Hollow, with the efficiency of groundwater, unseen, everywhere, arriving before you thought to look for it. The deputies didn't arrest Calloway. They couldn't yet. The formal charges were still being assembled by Haynes, who had gone back to the kitchen table and was working with the focused intensity of a man building something load-bearing. What they did was deliver a notice that he was under investigation for conspiracy and fraud, and that he was not to dispose of any property or documentation pending the inquiry. What happened in the Calloway house when that notice arrived, Amelia didn't know and didn't let herself imagine. What happened in Red Hollow over the following 3 days she saw firsthand because it spread the way things spread in small communities, through tone more than words, through the shift in how people looked at his name when it came up, through the particular silence that falls around a man everyone has known a long time, when they discover something about him that changes the whole account. The Pruitts knew first because Frank Pruitt was at the feed store when the deputies came through, and he had a 20-year memory for everything that happened in that county. Clara Boone knew by that evening. By the third day, it had reached the corners of the territory that news took longest to get to, and Seth Marsh sent a message to Cole, carried by a neighbor's boy on a brown pony, that said, in Seth's cramped and careful handwriting, "I heard. Good. S.M." It was not, Amelia thought, a triumphant moment. It was quieter than that, more like the specific relief of a wrongness beginning to be corrected, which is different from the satisfaction of a right thing accomplished. And anyone who's been through a real injustice knows the difference between those two feelings. Cole came to find her that Thursday evening. She was in the corral with Dust, working the mare through a series of turns she'd been practicing, and she rode over to the fence when she heard him come out. The light was going orange and flat, the way it went in the desert at this hour. Everything the same color, shadows long and specific. "Haynes is filing the formal complaint tomorrow," he said. "It'll go to the territorial court. A judge will review it within the month. And the land claim?" "Suspended pending investigation." He leaned on the fence rail. "The southwest parcel stays as it is. No building, no change." She nodded. Dust shifted beneath her, impatient with stillness. "Seth?" "I rode out to see him this afternoon. He was having a hard day, but his neighbor was with him, and I told the neighbor about the situation, so someone's watching out." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have been watching out before." "You didn't know." "I should have made a point of knowing." He said it without self-punishment, just the flat assessment of someone examining where a system failed. "He's out there alone, has been for years. That's something I should have been paying more attention to." She looked at him. It was a thing she'd come to in stages, this looking at Cole Walker directly and not looking away. Not out of defiance, but simply because she'd stopped expecting it to be a problem. He didn't seem to find it a problem either. He looked back with the same directness, like two people who had arrived without quite discussing it, at a mutual agreement about honesty. "What happens to you now?" he said. "After the legal matter settles." It was the first time either of them had addressed it this plainly. She'd been waiting for it and not waiting for it simultaneously. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "So have I." She looked at Dust's neck rather than at him. "I don't want to go back east. I said that before and I meant it, and I still mean it, but I also can't stay here indefinitely on the terms we have now. It's not right. You've been more than generous, and I've tried to pull my weight, but that's not a plan. That's a postponement." "No," Cole said. "It's not." He was quiet for a moment. The fence rail was old wood, weathered gray. He was looking at it rather than at her now, too, which felt like a kind of equity. "There's a parcel of land adjacent to the south pasture, about 40 acres. My father registered it in 1853, and it's been sitting unused since I inherited the place." He paused. "I could transfer it, or we could arrange something else. An agreement." She looked up. He was still looking at the fence rail. "What kind of agreement?" He didn't answer immediately. She'd learned that his pauses were not evasion. They were the space in which he composed things precisely, unwilling to say something imprecise. "I'm not good at this," he said finally. "I want to be straightforward with you because I think that's what you've always deserved, and didn't get enough of. So I'll say it plainly. I don't want you to leave. Not because this arrangement has been useful, although it has, and you know it has, but because—" He stopped. "Because I wake up in the morning thinking about what you're going to say that day. I didn't used to wake up thinking about anything except the work. The desert held its enormous quiet around them. "Cole," she said carefully, "I'm not asking you to feel the same way," he said quickly. The one thing he said quickly in a conversation that had otherwise moved at his usual deliberate pace. "I'm not asking for anything. I thought it was information you should have." She sat on dust for a moment, thinking. Not about whether she had feelings. She knew about her feelings. She'd been knowing about them for a month, and managing them with the same careful discipline she brought to the accounts and the writing and everything else she'd taken on here. She was thinking about Thomas, and about being 24 years old and alone with a baby, and the specific fear of trusting anything that felt like ground. "I lost my husband," she said, "and after he died, the people I thought would be there weren't. And then I came out here, and the man who'd written me 4 months of letters couldn't look me in the face." She wasn't looking at Cole, and she made herself look at him. "I don't trust easily. I'm aware that's a problem, and I'm aware it might always be a problem. I'm not cured of it." "I know that," he said. "So when I say that you are—" She stopped, gathered it. "You are the most honest person I have met in my adult life. And I don't mean that as a small thing. I mean it as the main thing." He looked at her. "I'm not ready," she said, "for whatever this might be. But I'm not saying no. I'm saying I need it to be slow, and I need it to be true, and I need you to understand that if you ever make me feel the way Robert Calloway made me feel, I will make you regret it." She said the last part without heat, just fact. Not as a threat, just so you know what you're dealing with. Something shifted in his face, that thing she'd seen in bits and pieces all along behind the weather and the economy of expression, something that was actually quite warm when it surfaced. "I know what I'm dealing with," he said. "I've known for a while." She looked at him for another moment and then turned dust away from the fence and rode a slow circle around the corral, needing to move, needing the simple physical reality of the horse and the ground and the air. When she came back around, Cole was still at the fence. "Slow," she said. "Slow," he agreed. She brought Dust to the gate and he opened it. Their hands were close for a moment on the latch, and neither of them made anything of it, but neither of them moved away either. And then Amelia led the mare through and they walked back toward the barn in the last of the desert light. And it was nothing. It was just walking, and it was also everything a beginning could reasonably be expected to be. What followed the next several weeks was not easy, and Amelia would have been suspicious of it if it had been. Haynes filed the formal complaint against Calloway on a Friday and rode back to Tucson on Saturday. The territorial court system moved with the speed of a place that covered enormous distances with limited resources, which was to say, slowly and with a great deal of paper. Calloway retained a lawyer from Phoenix, a man named Greer, who had a polished manner and a reputation for making fraud cases complicated enough that juries lost their grip on the essential facts. Haynes wrote to Cole about Greer with the terse assessment, formidable but not untouchable. There were weeks of uncertainty, weeks where the outcome seemed clear and then less clear, and then murky in ways that required Haynes to write long, careful letters explaining exactly how murky without either panicking his client or misleading him. Amelia read every letter Cole received, and he gave them to her without being asked, which was itself a statement about where things stood between them. She kept her own counsel on the hard days. She worked. She rode. She did the accounts and helped Margaret and carried Ethan on her hip through the daily rounds of the ranch, and put him down at night and sat at the kitchen table with the lamplight and sometimes wrote letters that she didn't send. To Thomas, to her mother, once to Ethan himself, a long rambling thing addressed to the version of him she imagined at 20, in case she didn't make it that far herself. The frontier had that effect. It made you practical about mortality because the alternative was not being practical. The shift in the town came gradually and then all at once, the way most things do. It started with Helen Pruitt, who invited Amelia to a household gathering in March. A small thing, 4 or 5 women at Helen's kitchen table doing mending and talking. Amelia almost said no. She sat with the invitation in her hand and thought about what it would mean to walk into a room full of women who had watched her arrive on that platform, and she thought about what it would mean to keep not doing it. She went. It was awkward for the first 20 minutes in the specific way these things are awkward, careful politeness, the slight stiffness of people adjusting to a new configuration. She helped with the mending, which she was good at. She answered questions about Ethan, who was by now a vigorous 8-month-old with strong opinions and a laugh that ambushed people. Clara Boone asked about Philadelphia. A woman named Ruth Ackerman, whose husband ran the tannery, asked how she'd come to learn to ride. Cole Walker taught me, she said. I fell off the first time. Ruth Ackerman laughed. A real one, unguarded. Frank Garver fell off 6 times when he was learning, and he tells everyone else it only happened twice, she said. Most people aren't honest about the falling. Something relaxed in the room after that. Not entirely. There were still adjustments being made, opinions still being revised, but the acute tension of it eased, and by the end of the afternoon, Amelia had been offered preserves by 3 separate women and had agreed to bring Ethan to the next gathering so the children could play together. She rode home in the late afternoon light and thought about what had changed. Not her, or not only her. The town had been watching her long enough that the story they'd been told about her and the story they were actually observing had grown far enough apart that the second one was winning. She told Margaret about the gathering at supper. Margaret listened and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Ruth Ackerman liked you." "I think so." "Ruth Ackerman," Margaret said, "does not like anyone without reason. She liked you because you earned it. She said it the way she said everything, plain, without embroidery. But it landed with weight." It was in April that Calloway's case began to come apart. Haynes wrote to say that Greer had filed 3 separate motions to exclude evidence, and all 3 had been denied by the territorial judge. Then he wrote to say that a man who'd done business with Calloway 2 years earlier had come forward voluntarily with documentation of a previous land scheme, smaller and less elegant than this one, but structurally similar, establishing a pattern that the court would be permitted to consider. Then, on a Tuesday that was otherwise entirely ordinary, a writer came from Tucson with a letter from Haynes. Cole read it at the kitchen table. His face didn't do much, which was his face's consistent position on significant events. He set the letter down and pushed it across the table to Amelia. Calloway had settled. Not a court victory to her, a settlement, which was what happened when a man with enough money decided the cost of losing publicly was higher than the cost of resolution. He had agreed to withdraw his support from Denton's claim, to pay restitution to Seth Marsh, and to sign a document acknowledging the established use rights of the neighboring ranchers on the southwest parcel. He had also agreed to cover Haynes's legal fees, which had been Amelia's idea, communicated to Cole, who had communicated it to Haynes, who had included it in the negotiation. Denton's claim was withdrawn. The land sat as it had always sat. The creek still ran through the southwest corner. He didn't admit guilt, Cole said. Settlements never require it, Amelia said, but everyone knows what it means. She thought about Robert Calloway, about the man who had written her careful letters for 4 months and left a note with a station boy. She tried to feel something decisive about him, triumph or contempt or the particular satisfaction of watching someone get what they deserved, and found that mostly what she felt was tired. He hadn't been worth the energy he'd taken. He'd been a man with small feelings who'd made them into other people's problems, and now those problems were resolved, and what remained of him in her mind was less than she'd expected. She went to tell Seth Marsh in person. She rode out alone, on dust, which she could now do over 8 miles of desert terrain without incident and without anyone worrying, which had taken a while to establish. Seth was having a good day, one of his clear days, all the lights on. He listened to her account of the settlement, his hands folded on the table, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "The restitution," he said. "I don't want it." She looked at him. "It's yours. What Denton took from you." "I know what Denton took," he said. "I want you to give it to the church fund for the Harker's Crossing School. They've been trying to build a proper schoolhouse for 2 years. He paused. "There are children in this territory who need something to grow into. That's a better use." She looked at him for a moment. "I'll see that it gets there," she said. He nodded. He looked out his window at the land he'd worked for 30 years, and his face had the particular quality that very old faces sometimes have. The quality of having arrived somewhere after a long journey and finding it more or less what they'd expected. "You're staying," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Good." He turned back from the window. Cole Walker is a better man than he lets on, which means he's a very good man indeed. She rode home through the spring afternoon with dust under her moving at a pace they'd found together over 3 months of practice. Not the tentative negotiation of the early weeks, but something settled, a mutual rhythm they'd arrived at through accumulated trust. The desert was doing what it did in April, which was attempt color, small blooms on things that looked too dry and sparse to produce them, the particular bright yellow of desert flowers against red rock. She thought about the letter she'd read on the platform. I cannot accept a woman with another man's child. She thought about what it had felt like to stand there with that letter and the train leaving and the town watching. She'd thought, at this time, that she was reading the end of something, the final evidence that there was no place for her. She had been wrong about that, not because things had gone easily. They hadn't, and she'd known they wouldn't, and the knowing hadn't made the hard parts easier, but because the end she'd been handed on that platform had turned out to be the beginning of the only story that was actually hers. When she got back, Cole was at the fence watching her ride in. He'd been doing that more, not hovering, nothing as clumsy as hovering, just present in a way that was different from the practical availability of the early weeks. He opened the corral gate without being asked, which was something he'd started doing, a small daily thing that she'd stopped pretending not to appreciate. "Seth?" he asked. "Good day," she said. "He's giving the restitution to the Harker's Crossing School." Cole absorbed this. That sounds like Seth. She brought Dust to a stop and looked down at him. The late afternoon light was doing what it did to everything it touched at this hour, making it specific, particular, worth looking at directly. "He said you're a better man than you let on," she said. "He said that means you're a very good man." Cole's expression did that thing where it moved without quite arriving anywhere. "Seth talks too much," he said. "He talks exactly the right amount," she said. She dismounted and handed him the reins. Not because she couldn't manage them herself, but because he was there and it was natural, and she was done performing self-sufficiency for an audience that wasn't watching anymore. He took them and walked the mare toward the barn, and she fell into step beside him, and neither of them spoke for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her. "I've been thinking about what you said at the fence, about waking up thinking about what I'm going to say." She kept her eyes on the path. "I do the same thing. I didn't plan to. I wouldn't have chosen to if I'm being completely honest, because it's frightening in a specific way I don't have language for." She glanced at him. "But I wanted you to know, since we're doing the thing where we tell each other what's actually true." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I appreciate it." "That's all?" "I'm thinking." "You're always thinking." "It usually produces better outcomes than the alternative." He stopped at the barn door and looked at her with the full, unhurried attention he gave to things that mattered. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "I'm glad you stayed. I'm glad every stubborn, difficult, complicated thing about you came through my gate in January." He paused. "Is that the kind of thing you needed to hear?" She looked at him for a long moment. The barn smelled of hay and horse and the particular warmth of enclosed animals. And Dust was nudging at the door, and somewhere in the house, Ethan was either asleep or conducting the kind of experimental noise-making that he'd recently discovered was possible. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly the kind of thing." He nodded and opened the barn door and led Dust inside, and Amelia stood in the doorway for a moment just breathing, and thought, this is what solid ground feels like. Not perfect, not painless, just real. In the way that only things you've actually built can be real, with the seams showing and the weight of it fully present. She went inside to find her son. Ethan was awake and sitting up on his blanket in the kitchen with Margaret, doing what he'd recently taken to doing with great seriousness, taking objects and placing them in a line on the floor and then contemplating the line as if it meant something. He looked up when Amelia came in and produced the expression that still, after 8 months of it, stopped her in her tracks. That total, unconditional brightness, the one that said, "You are the thing I was waiting for," with a completeness that no adult in her life had ever managed and probably never would. She sat down on the floor next to him and put her back against the cabinet, and he climbed into her lap with the certainty of a person who has never doubted his welcome. And she held him and looked out the window at the desert going gold in the evening light. Margaret put a cup of tea on the floor beside her without comment and went back to what she was doing. Outside, Cole came out of the barn and checked the fence line and then stood for a moment looking at the south pasture with the look of a man surveying something he intends to keep. He turned back toward the house, and the light caught him, and Amelia watched through the window with the particular sensation of someone who has finally arrived somewhere after a very long and uncertain journey and is still catching up to the fact of having arrived. She was not finished being afraid. She was not finished being careful. She would carry Thomas with her always, and that was right. And she would carry the girl who'd stood on the platform. And that was right too, because you don't get to keep what you've been through without also keeping what you learned from it. But she was here. She was staying. And that, for now, was what solid ground felt like. Not the absence of everything hard, but the presence of something worth standing on. The spring that year came in like it was making up for something. After the long gray of February and the uncertain skies of March, April arrived with the particular extravagance of a desert that has been holding its breath, color appearing on things that had seemed dead, warmth returning to the ground, the creek in the southwest pasture running full and clear the way it was supposed to. Amelia noticed all of it with the heightened attention of someone who had learned at considerable cost not to take seasons for granted. The Callaway settlement had been signed and filed and was now a legal document in the territorial court records, which meant it was permanent in the way that only written things are permanent. Robert Callaway himself had become, in the weeks since, a figure on the periphery of Red Hollow's social life in the specific way of men whose schemes have been publicly unraveled, still present, still with money and land, but diminished in some essential way that money couldn't repair. People spoke to him when they had to. They didn't seek him out. Amelia did not feel the satisfaction she'd expected to feel about this. What she felt instead was something flatter and more complete, the sense of a wrong thing having been corrected. The book's balanced, no more drama required. She found she thought about him rarely, and when she did it was without the jagged quality that anger had given the thoughts in the early months. He had become, essentially, a man she used to know something about. That was probably the best possible outcome. Not dramatic justice, just the steady erasure of his importance in her life. What occupied her now was more interesting and more difficult than any of that. Cole had taken her out to the South Parcel on a Sunday in early April, the 40 acres his father had registered in 1853 and left untouched. They rode out together on Dust and on Cole's gray gelding buck, and Amelia looked at the land the way she'd been learning to look at things out here. Not for what it was right now, but for what it could carry. The soil was thin in places, rocky in others. There was a slight rise to the southwest that would make a reasonable building site, protected from the worst of the wind, with sightlines in 3 directions. The corner of the parcel touched the creek. "What do you think?" Cole said. She thought many things. She thought about the practical questions first because the practical questions were the ones she could answer: water access, soil depth, what you could grow in this climate and what you couldn't, what a modest house would require and what a kitchen garden needed, and how much of this she actually knew versus how much she was going to have to learn. She'd gotten good at distinguishing between those two categories. "I think it would take work," she said. "Everything worth having does," he said. He wasn't being philosophical. It was just true, the way the distance to Tucson was just true. She looked at the rise. "The corner with the creek, that's the building site. That's where I'd put it."
Not so close to the creek that the spring floods are a problem. No, back about 30 yards. He'd already thought about this. She could tell by the way he said it, not offering an idea but confirming one. He'd been thinking about this parcel and what it could be for longer than she had, which gave her a feeling she couldn't quite name, something between being moved and being frightened, which were often closer together than people admitted. "I'd need to learn more about building," she said. "I can cook and ride and do accounts, but I've never built anything." Pete's father is a carpenter in Harker's Crossing. He takes on apprentices. He paused. "Also, I built most of the Walker House additions myself. I could teach you what I know." She looked at him. "You want to teach me to build a house?" "I want to help you build a house," he said. "There's a difference." She understood the difference. The first meant instruction delivered from a position of authority. The second meant standing next to someone. She'd experienced both from Cole by now and understood exactly which one he was offering. "All right," she said. They sat on their horses in the April sun and looked at the 40 acres, and Amelia let herself, carefully, with full awareness that she was doing it, imagine what it would look like in 5 years. A house on the rise, a kitchen garden, Ethan running towards something or away from something with the full-body commitment of a 4-year-old who hasn't yet learned that falling hurts. Something tightened in her chest and she breathed through it, which was how she'd learned to handle the moments when the future presented itself too vividly and the combination of hope and terror became almost structural. "Slow," she said quietly. "Slow," Cole agreed, and they turned the horses back toward the ranch. The conversation about what they were to each other happened in June, and it happened the way important conversations between people who don't waste words tend to happen, briefly, without ceremony, and with a finality that didn't require revisiting. They were doing accounts at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening when Cole set his pen down and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the answer doesn't change anything about what I've offered you with the land or this house." She put her pen down too. "All right." He looked at her with the directness she'd come to rely on as the most constant thing about him. "I would like to marry you," he said, "when you're ready, if you ever are. I'm not in a hurry, and I'm not going to pressure you, but I didn't want to leave it unsaid any longer because it felt dishonest to keep it to myself." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, Ethan was asleep, 9 months old, and recently acquired a habit of sleeping with both arms flung wide, like someone who'd claimed the whole crib as territory. Margaret was somewhere in the back of the house. The lamp on the table made everything amber and close. "I want to tell you something first," she said, "about why this is hard. You don't have to explain." "I want to," she said. "You've been honest with me from the first day, and I owe you the same." She looked at the lamp rather than at him, because some things were easier to say to a fixed point. When Thomas died, the grief was bad enough. But what came after? The people who turned away. The brother-in-law who couldn't get me out fast enough, coming out here and finding that letter at the station. Each of those things was a lesson in the same subject, which was that the ground under me could go at any time, and that depending on it was a risk I might not survive again. She looked at him then. "You have not given me a single reason to doubt you. But that fear doesn't care about reasons. It lives underneath reason, and I need you to know it's there, so that when I seem distant or difficult or like I'm holding something back, you understand what it is." He was quiet. Then he said, "I'm not going anywhere." "You don't know that." "No one knows that," he said. "But I mean it as fully as it's possible to mean something you can't guarantee. And I know the difference between a promise I can keep and one I can't. I'm not promising you a life with no hard things in it. I'm promising that whatever hard things come, I want to face them next to you instead of alone." She looked at him for a long time. The lamp burned steadily between them. "Yes," she said. "When I'm ready." He picked his pen back up. "Then I'll wait," he said, and went back to the accounts. She sat there a moment longer, looking at the side of his face while he worked, and thought about what it meant that the most romantic moment of her adult life had just taken place over a ledger book at a kitchen table in Arizona, and found that she couldn't have designed it better if she'd tried. The readiness came in August, which surprised her by arriving earlier than she'd expected. She'd thought it would take longer, thought she'd need another season, another full turn of the desert calendar, before the fear settled to a level she could marry on top of. But August came and she woke up one morning with the particular clarity that sometimes follows a long, difficult sleep, and she knew. She found Cole at the corral before breakfast and said, "I'm ready." He turned from the fence and looked at her. Just looked for a moment, with an expression that was the most unguarded she'd ever seen on his face. The expression of a man who had been patient for a long time and was now being told the wait was over. "All right," he said. "I want something small," she said. "Just the people who actually matter." "I only know how to do small," he said. "And I want to keep my name," she said. "Whitaker. It was Thomas's and it's Ethan's, and I don't want to give it up. You can think of it as hyphenated, or you can think of it as me being difficult. I've thought of you as difficult since January," he said. "It hasn't changed my position." She looked at him. "Walker Whitaker," she said. "Or we could both be Walker Whitaker." He thought about it for a half second. "Walker Whitaker," he said. "Fine by me." They were married on a Saturday in late August, in the yard of the Walker Ranch, which had the advantage of being the place where all the things that had led to this had actually happened. The wagon rides, and the corral lessons, and the kitchen table nights, and the dark yard where she'd stood with the rifle. Amelia had never been the kind of woman who'd spent years imagining a wedding, and she was glad of that now because what she had was better than anything she'd have imagined in her younger years. Not prettier, not grander, but real in a way that only things paid for with actual living tend to be. Margaret stood beside her. Pete and Jeb were there, both of them clean-shaved and slightly uncomfortable in their good shirts. Seth Marsh came, driven over by his neighbor, and sat in the shade with Ethan on his knee for most of the ceremony, the two of them appearing to conduct their own separate conversation that had nothing to do with the proceedings. The Pruitts came, and Clara Boone, and Ruth Ackerman, and a dozen other people whose faces Amelia had learned over the past 8 months and could now attach to stories, to complaints about their husbands, and praise for their children and opinions about the best method for keeping root vegetables through the winter. Judge Callahan from Harker's Crossing performed the ceremony. He was 70 years old and had been marrying people in the territory since before it was organized, and he had the relaxed manner of a man who understood that weddings were fundamentally simple events being asked to carry enormous symbolic weight, and that the best thing he could do was say the necessary words and get out of the way. When it was done, when Cole had put a plain gold band on her finger with the steady hands of a man who was not nervous but was very serious, Amelia looked out at the people in the yard and had a feeling she didn't have good language for. Not happiness, exactly, or not only that. Something more complex. The way most true things are complex. She thought about the girl she'd been in Philadelphia, and the woman who'd stood on the platform, and everything in between, and she thought, you could not have gotten here any other way. Every hard thing was load-bearing. Every loss was part of the structure of this moment. That was not a comfortable thought. It didn't make the losses less. But it was true. Margaret, beside her, said nothing, which was exactly right. The building of the house on the south parcel began in September and took the better part of 7 months. Cole had not exaggerated about his carpentry. He was good at it in the thorough, unhurried way. He was good at most physical things, understanding the logic of structure the way Amelia understood the logic of numbers. He taught her as he taught her to ride and to use the rifle, which was to say by showing her once and then expecting her to apply it, correcting mistakes plainly without making them into commentary on her character. She was not naturally gifted at it. Her hands blistered and she misjudged angles, and there was an afternoon in November when she split a board she'd spent 2 hours planing and sat down in the dirt next to the sawhorses, and said several words she'd learned from Pete that she would not be repeating in company. Cole looked at the ruined board and said, "The angle on the plane was off. Here," and showed her again, and that was the end of it. She got better. Not good in the way Cole was good. That would take years. But competent, which was all she'd asked of herself. Competent enough to do her share of the work. Competent enough that when they set the last roof beam in February and stood back and looked at what they'd built, she could look at it with the specific satisfaction of someone who knew which parts her hands had touched. Ethan had turned 1 in December. He was walking by then, the lurching, determined walking of a child who has identified a new capability and intends to exploit it completely. And he'd spent the house-building months being managed in rotation between Amelia and Margaret and Pete, who had developed an unexpected attachment to the baby that he was deeply embarrassed about, and that everyone found privately delightful. On the day they moved the first furniture into the South Parcel house, Amelia carried Ethan across the threshold first. She'd not planned this consciously. It wasn't a ceremony, just a sequence of events. But she was aware of doing it, aware of the weight of him on her hip and the way he was looking around at the new interior with the round-eyed assessment of someone encountering new territory. This was the home she was building for him, not the one she'd imagined on the train coming west, not the Callaway ranch that had been presented as the answer and then snatched away. This one, made of this specific wood in this specific corner of the Arizona desert, by people who had actually chosen to be here. "This is yours," she told him, "or part of it. You'll have to earn the rest." He grabbed her collar and studied her face with the seriousness he brought to things he didn't yet understand. She kissed his forehead and set him down on the plank floor, and he immediately sat down and began investigating the texture of the wood with both hands, which was essentially Ethan's approach to all new things,
and had produced so far very good results. The house was not large. 3 rooms, a main room with the kitchen, 2 sleeping rooms, the second one sized with a future in mind that she and Cole had not explicitly discussed but both understood. The windows faced east and west for the morning and evening light. The kitchen garden had been started in the fall and would be ready for planting in April. The kitchen itself had a proper iron range that Cole and Pete had brought out from Red Hollow on a wagon with the careful reverence of men transporting something both heavy and expensive, and which Amelia had placed her hand on when it was installed and felt, in the strange, irrational way of certain objects, like something finally in its right place. Margaret came to see the finished house on a Sunday. She walked through it slowly, touching things with her fingertips in the particular way she had of assessing the world through contact: door frames, window sills, the edge of the kitchen table that Cole had built to Amelia's specifications. She said nothing for most of the tour. When she came back to the main room, she stood in the middle of it and looked at Amelia. "You built this," she said. "Cole built most of it," Amelia said. "I helped." "You built this," Margaret said again, and Amelia understood she wasn't talking about carpentry. She looked around the room, at the window with the view of the south pasture, at the table and the range and the cradle in the corner that Seth Marsh had sent over, carved by his own hands with the particular care of someone who knows they are making something for a child to grow up beside. At Ethan, who had migrated to the corner and was working on pulling himself upright against the wall with the focused determination that characterized every physical challenge he undertook. "Yes," she said, "I suppose I did." There was a moment between them, a long, quiet one that contained more than either of them would have put into words. The whole 8 months of it. The letters and the platform, and the cold kitchen mornings and the dark yard and Seth's signature, and the ledger books, and everything else, compressed into a moment of looking at a room they were both standing in because of all of it. Then Ethan succeeded in pulling himself to standing and turned to look at them with an expression of such complete triumph that both women laughed, and the moment expanded and became the afternoon. And Margaret stayed for supper, and Cole came over from the main ranch for it, and Pete showed up uninvited with an apple pie he'd bought at the Pruitt store and presented with the casual manner of someone who had not been planning this at all. They ate at the new kitchen table, and it was not elegant, and nobody made speeches, and Ethan fell asleep in his cradle halfway through the meal with the sudden completeness of young children, and Amelia looked around the table at these people, this specific, improbable collection of people, and thought about what it meant to belong somewhere. She had grown up believing that belonging was something you were born into, that it was given to you by the circumstances of your birth, your family, your city, your station, and that the measure of a life was how well you maintained what you'd been handed. Thomas's death had taken everything she'd been handed, and the loss of it had felt, at the time, like the loss of herself. She understood now that she'd had it backward. Belonging wasn't something you inherited, it was something you built. The same way you built a house, with work and time and the willingness to keep going when the angle was wrong and the board split and you had to sit down in the dirt and find another way. The people at this table had not been given to her. She had found them, or they had found her, in the brutal sifting process of shared difficulty, and they were hers because of that, not in spite of it. Robert Calloway had rejected her because she came with a child. What she had not understood then, and understood completely now, was that Ethan was not the thing that made her difficult. Ethan was the thing that had required her to be exactly who she was. The stubbornness, the paper-keeping, the refusal to leave when leaving would have been easier. The willingness to stand in a dark yard with a rifle because her son was inside and the world outside was uncertain. Without him, she might have gone back east on the Thursday stage and built a smaller, safer life in the ruins of the one she'd lost. Because of him, she was here. She thought about the letters sometimes. Less often now, and differently. She used to think about it with the acute pain of a fresh wound, then with the duller, cooler ache of something healed but marked. Now with something that was almost, not gratitude exactly, because gratitude toward someone who had treated her poorly seemed like a distortion, a rewarding of bad behavior with good feeling. Not gratitude, but acknowledgement. The worst moment had been load-bearing. You could know that without being glad it happened. What she was glad of was specific. She was glad of dust, and the way the horse had taught her that trust was built in accumulated small increments, not given in one large gesture. She was glad of Margaret's particular form of love, which looked like correction and produced capability. She was glad of Cole's patience, which was not passive. She'd learned that about him, but was the active, deliberate choice of a man who understood that some things could not be rushed without being ruined. She was glad of Seth Marsh's clear-eyed dignity, and of Pete's apple pie, and of Ruth Ackerman's laugh, and of the Garver brothers' uncomplicated anger, and all the other things that had added up over 8 months of daily life to a community. She was glad of herself, which was the most complicated gladness of all, the kind that doesn't come easy to people who've been told, in various direct and indirect ways, that they're too much trouble to be worth it. She'd stopped believing that somewhere between the platform and the corral. She couldn't have said exactly when. It had happened the way most real changes happen, not in a single revelatory moment, but in the slow accumulation of days that added up to a different person without announcing it. In the spring, Ethan took his first real steps. Not the wall-assisted standing he'd been practicing, but actual independent steps. 3 of them, in the kitchen of the new house, with Amelia crouched 3 feet away with her arms out. He made it to her and then sat down hard and looked at her with an expression that said, both, "I did it," and that was terrifying with perfect simultaneity. "I know," she said. "It gets easier." He wasn't convinced, which was reasonable. She hadn't been convinced either, the first time. You didn't get to skip the terrifying part on the way to the easier part. That was the part that made the easier part mean something. Cole was in the doorway. He'd seen it. The 3 steps, the sitting down, the look on Amelia's face when Ethan made it to her arms. He came in and crouched beside them on the floor with the unselfconscious ease of a man who had stopped worrying about whether he belonged in this particular domestic scene. 3 steps, he said to Ethan. Ethan looked at him with the frank, evaluating stare he'd been turning on Cole since the first night in the wagon, which had gradually, over the course of months and daily proximity, shifted into something warmer and less formal. He reached out and grabbed Cole's finger with both hands. "He does that when he trusts you," Amelia said. Cole looked at the baby holding his finger. His expression was the one she thought of as his real face. Not the weathered, careful face he showed the world, but the one underneath it, the one that appeared in unguarded moments when he didn't know she was watching or had forgotten to manage it. Open, in a way that cost him something, present in a way he didn't always allow himself to be. 3 steps, he said again quietly. "Next week it'll be 4, Amelia said. Then he'll be running, and we'll spend the summer chasing him." "We," Cole said, not questioning it, noting it, the way he noted things he valued, plainly, without ornamentation. "We," she said. They sat on the kitchen floor of the house they'd built, the 3 of them, in the spring morning light, and it was nothing spectacular, says a man and a woman and a baby in a room in Arizona, which was a thing happening in hundreds of houses across the territory at that exact moment. And it was also in the way that specific, particular, hard-won things are everything. Exactly what it was, exactly what it meant, exactly what it had cost to get to, and worth every bit of the cost. Later that afternoon, after Cole had gone back to the main ranch and Ethan was asleep, Amelia rode Dust out to the ridge above the south parcel. She did this sometimes, not often, but on days that seemed to require a wider view. She sat on the horse on the ridge and looked at the house below and the land around it, and the desert extending in every direction, enormous and indifferent and full of everything. She thought about the woman who'd stepped off the train in January with $6 and a baby and a letter that said she wasn't wanted. She could see her clearly, the dark blue dress, the trunk she couldn't carry alone, the jaw set against the watching town. She felt affection for her, that woman. And something else, a clear-eyed recognition that she herself was not that woman anymore, and hadn't been for some time, and that this was not the loss it might have seemed. That woman had been doing the best she could with what she had. What she had now was more. Not easier, not painless, more, larger, with more room in it for the things that mattered. The desert wind moved through the land below. The creek caught the afternoon light. The house on the rise. Her house,
made of her work and other people's steadiness and the months of difficulty that had preceded it, sat solid on the Arizona ground. She thought about something Seth Marsh had said to her on one of his good days, a month or so after the settlement. They'd been sitting at his kitchen table, and she'd asked him, without quite planning to, what he thought the West was for, why people came, what it offered that other places didn't. He'd thought about it for a while in the way he thought about things that deserved thinking. Then he said, "It doesn't already know who you are. That's the thing. Back east, in settled places, they've got a story about you before you open your mouth. Who your family is, what you've done, what you haven't. Out here, the land hasn't got a story about you yet. You get to be the one who writes it." She hadn't replied at the time, just let the idea sit. Now, on the ridge with dust still beneath her and the whole of the territory spread out in the afternoon light, she thought, yes, that was it exactly. The land had not known who she was when she arrived, and so she'd had the opportunity, the hard, ungiven, entirely self-funded opportunity to decide. She had decided. Not once, in a single dramatic moment, but in the way decisions like that are actually made. In small daily choices that accumulated into a direction, in the decision to stay instead of leave, to ride instead of wait, to carry letters instead of regrets, to trust a specific man's specific steady presence, to build a house with her own imperfect hands rather than wait for one to be given to her. She turned dust back down the ridge toward the house, and the horse moved under her with the easy confidence of an animal that knows exactly where it's going and trusts the person on its back to know the same. Below, the house waited. Inside it, her son was sleeping. Down the road, the man she'd married was working the land he'd been working his whole adult life, and would go on working, with her beside him now, which changed it, which changed everything, the way the presence of one true thing changes the whole account. She rode down off the ridge and into the life she had built. It was not what she had planned. It was not what she had been promised. It was not smooth or painless or delivered to her with any kind of ease. It was hers. Every part of it, the difficult parts most of all. And that, she had learned, was the only way anything worth having ever was.
Oh my God, with handshakes, literally today I had someone from another Wi-Fi company coming in and end up convincing me to go with their plan because I will pay less than what I do now. When they were leaving, the guy did a firm handshake with the first girl, did the limp one. She's like, oh my God, no, it's so floppy like a fish out of water. Then the third girl had a very firm handshake, and I was like, yay, finally a woman with a firm. Yes, exactly, saw him. 100%. I'm going to respect you so fucking much if you have a firm handshake as a woman. There's just something fucking about it, man. Like, give me a firm fucking handshake. Then I'm going to like, all right, we're one and the same. All right, hell yeah. Fuck yeah. But I get it. Some people are not raised that way, right? Or just don't like to do that. They want to appear small. Sometimes people do. But when, even from a guy, when it's a guy and a guy doesn't give me a firm handshake, okay, I'll put it this way. If a guy gives me too firm of a handshake, though, exactly. I agree, Ocean. Exactly. You got to match the energy. 100%. Yes. But like, if someone gives me a handshake that's like gripping me to the point of like,